then it applies to a book in the Bible. Now this will help you more in the study of some books in the Bible than it will in others. But I just love to start the book right at the beginning and then the end. You know, sometimes if you're reading a story that interests you, you start and then you wonder, how does it end? And then sometimes you go right on over and you see how the whole thing ends. Well, that may be good in some books and it may not be good in others. But when I study a book in the Bible, I like to keep that in mind because it barbs a thing in my mind. How does it begin and how does it end? Then I apply that same thing to a chapter in the Bible. Again, this doesn't help you as much in all the chapters as it does in others. But many times I can get a whole chapter before my mind if I just notice how it begins and how it ends. For example, the 3rd chapter of Colossians begins with the words, "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things that are above, where Christ is seated on the right hand of God." And then the chapter closes with the servant, with the slave, the servant, serving in menial tasks. Spurgeon had an interesting way of summarizing the 3rd chapter of Colossians. He said Colossians chapter 3 begins in heaven and it ends in the kitchen. Well, that was his way of saying that all the truths of God are very practical and down to earth. And so you see, you start off, it begins in heaven, risen with Christ. And then it ends in the kitchen. If I'm really risen with Christ, then in everyday ordinary things I'm going to live for the glory of the Lord. Then it's true of a sentence in the Bible. Often, how does a sentence begin and how does a sentence end? Now, there are some very short sentences in the Bible and there's some very long sentences. For example, Ephesians 1, 3 to 14 is in the correct punctuation, only one sentence. It's one of the longest sentences in the Bible. And you know, you can get all involved. You go through that and you wonder, well, now, just where am I? Well, sometimes it's good to start off with how it begins and then come right on to how it ends. And the same thing's true of a paragraph in the Bible. Now, many of our Bibles do not have the arrangement of paragraphs. The Scofield Bible, that has the King James Version, has a certain paragraph arrangement. That's one reason why, along with the King James, I like to use the American Standard Version of 1901, because it has such a wonderful paragraph arrangement. You know, sometimes those paragraphs will begin at the end of a certain chapter and they'll go right on over into the beginning of the next chapter. Now, I notice some of you are preachers, and I hope that you preachers will profit especially by this idea of terminal points. And remember, it won't help you equally in all parts, but it will be very helpful. All right, now let's come back to our question. Genesis is the foundation of the Bible, and Revelation is the top stone. Since the book of Genesis records the beginnings of God's redemptive plan, and since Revelation records the consummation, the completion of His redemptive plan, these two books should be studied together. By studying the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis along with the last 2 or 3 chapters of Revelation, what basic differences do you find? In Revelation, things are far better for the redeemed, for those who are saved. In Revelation, things are far better for the redeemed, for the saved, in a twofold way. First, they're better for the redeemed than before the fall into sin. And then they're better for the redeemed than after the fall into sin. Now let me develop that. In Revelation, things are far better for saved people, for the redeemed, than before the fall. You see, in the old heavens and the old earth, there was the sun and there was the moon. But when you come to Revelation, there's no need for the sun. Why don't you need any sun? Why do we need the sun here now? That shows you one great difference between the two. And that is that in Revelation, when God's plan of redemption is complete, there is a much clearer vision of God. a much clearer revelation of Christ. Jesus Christ shines in the new heavens and the new earth, and if God were to turn on the sun in the new heavens and the new earth, you wouldn't even see it. You know, you go out at noonday sometimes and you turn on your flashlight, and you can hardly see the flashlight because the sun is so glorious. Well, if God were to turn on the sun up in heaven, you wouldn't even see it because the glory of Christ is so great. And yet down here on earth, we have the sun and the moon. In the new heavens and the new earth, there will be a far greater revelation of God. How wonderful that is. You see, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. Wonder if you know where that passage is. Romans 5 verse 20. I love that verse. Romans 5:20 says, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. The literal Greek there is very wonderful. You know, the New Testament was written in the Greek language, and the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. And the literal Greek of Romans 5:20 says, where sin flowed, grace did overflow. One of my preacher friends likes to render it, where sin flowed, grace did overflow its banks. It's a picture of a river that at its flood season just overflows its banks and sweeps everything before it. Suppose Adam and Eve had never sinned. You see, they would not have had as clear a revelation of God as they will have in the new heavens and the new earth. I believe I can show you when we come to it later that Adam and Eve were saved after they sinned. You're going to be able to meet them in heaven someday if you're saved. I've heard many people talk about ones they want to meet in heaven. I don't remember ever having heard anybody say, I want to meet Adam in heaven. I want to meet Eve in heaven. I do, because they started the ball of sin rolling in the human family. So to speak, they got us into an awful mess. Well, if I'd been back there in their place, I'd have gotten everybody in the same mess. You would have done the same thing, but somebody says, Adam doesn't deserve to be in heaven. Eve doesn't deserve to be in heaven. No, and neither do I. But you see, in heaven, they're going to have a fuller revelation of God than they would have had if they'd never sinned in the first place. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. Where sin flowed, grace overflowed. Grace did overflow its banks. So in that first way, in Revelation, the situation is far better than it was in Genesis, than before the fall. And then the second way is, it's far better than after the fall. I think the great illustration of this is the tree of life. You remember, God put the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And then, after man sinned, God put a sword around that tree to keep people from eating of the tree of life. Well, you see, that's just a picture of what sin does. Sin separates you from God. And you notice how complete the picture is? It was a sword, sharp, it cut you. And Adam and Eve wouldn't be tempted to come and eat of that tree of life with the sword there. But it was not only a sword, it was a flaming sword. It was a sword on fire. See, it just emphasizes the idea of the fact that sin separates from God. Separates from God. But it was not only a sword and a flaming sword, it was a revolving flaming sword. It said a sword that turned every way to keep the way to the tree of life. Just try to imagine that as it throws its flames out in every direction. You see, it's complete separation from God. Then you come to the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, the tree of life is there, but there's a big difference. There's no flaming sword around it to keep us from the tree of life. Revelation 22 verse 14 says, Revelation 22:14, blessed are they that wash their robes. Wash their robes in the blood of Christ, in the blood of the Lamb. Blessed are they that wash their robes, that they may have a right to the tree of life. I'm going to have a perfect right to the tree of life. Not going to be any flaming sword there to keep me away from it. And you know why not? Because Jesus died on the cross. And when Jesus died on the cross, that flaming sword went into his soul. And he took that sword away from me, so I've got a perfect right to that tree of life through the blood of the Lamb. Matthew 27:46 gives us the words of Jesus on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Oh, that's the most solemn moment of all human history. It's sometimes called the darkest moment of all human history, because there Jesus was suffering separation from God. Why? In order that that sword of separation might enter into his soul. I'm not afraid of hell. When I was a small boy, I was afraid of hell. And I tell you, I like to see people who are afraid of hell if they aren't Christians. I heard Vance Havner say one time, I'd rather scare men into heaven than lull them into hell. And oh, we need that truth of hell, but I'm not afraid of hell, because Jesus took my hell when he died for me on the cross. You see, all that separation from God is gone now. And at any moment I can look up and say, Lord, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Jesus took my separation from God when he died for me on the cross. So to summarize it, in a twofold way, things are far better for saved people, for the redeemed, at the end of Revelation than they are at the beginning of Genesis. First, they're better than before the fall. There's a much clearer revelation of God. And then they're much better than after the fall. Because you see what a picture of separation that is. It was a sword that'll cut you. It was a sword on fire, a flaming sword. And it was a revolving sword, one that just threw its flames out everywhere. Complete separation. But Jesus took that complete separation when he cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Show how the following passages help to give a bird's eye view of God's redemptive purposes as presented in the Bible. Now, in order to see how these three passages summarize the Bible, notice the threefold repetition of the tree. The first one, just draw a circle in your notes around the tree of life. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then in Galatians 3:13, draw a circle around the last word, a tree. Cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. That's talking about the cross now. And then Revelation 22:2, again the tree of life. On this side of the river, and on that was the tree of life, bearing 12 manner of fruits, yielding its fruit every month. See what a tree that is. You know, you have some trees that may yield fruit more than once during a year. But here's one that yields fruit every month. Have you ever known a tree like that? You see, it's a figure of how wonderful things will be. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Some like to translate it the helping of the nations. That is, giving help to the nations. Here's a good summary of the whole Bible. I'm going to put a diagram on the board and see if you can tell me what is wrong with this diagram. What's incomplete about it. The story of the whole Bible is from the tree of life to the tree of life, by way of the tree on which Christ was crucified. See, that's the reference in Galatians 3:13. Now, I wonder how many of you can see this isn't exactly wrong, but it doesn't give you the complete picture. What change would you make in that diagram to give what the Bible's talking about and to emphasize Romans 5:20, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound? What change would I have to make in my diagram? You see, it's not from the tree of life to the tree of life. I just rubbed that out. But it's from the tree of life to the trees of life. by way of the cross, by way of the tree on which Christ was crucified. I used to wonder a little bit about this. It says, on either side of the river was there the tree of life. And I thought, now what does that mean? On either side of the river is the tree of life. Was there one tree over here and another tree over there? Many students of the Greek New Testament think that the word tree in Revelation 22 should be translated orchard. They take it to be a collective noun, not just a picture of one individual tree, but a whole orchard of trees. I think that's what it's talking about. And you see, that's the story of the Bible. It's not from the tree of life to the tree of life by way of the tree on which Christ was crucified. But it's to the orchard of life. In other words, things won't be as good as they would have been if we'd never fallen into sin, but they'll be far better. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. Now, of course, that's the figure which is used. Now, let me prove it to you from two very definite verses. One verse is Hebrews 2, verse 7. Hebrews 2:7 says that when God made man, He made man lower than the angels. I keep that in mind for a moment. He made man lower than the angels. Hebrews 2:7. Then 1 Corinthians 6:3 says, know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? I don't even begin to know all that's going to be included in that. How tremendous that is. You know, we think of these two good angels are the only angels mentioned in the Bible by name. Of course, we have Lucifer, and just whether or not that should be a proper name is open to a question of interpretation. But there are only two good angels mentioned by name in the Bible. One is Michael, the archangel, the highest of the angels, and then the other is Gabriel, the angel Gabriel. And I'm apt to think, well, now Gabriel's way up here and I'm down here, yes? But you see, one day I'm going to judge Gabriel. One day I'm going to judge Michael. I don't begin to tell you all that's going to be included in that. After all, some folks have the idea that when you get to heaven, that's just everything you get all at once, and then heaven will be kind of dull. You'll have it all. Heaven will be like this. It'll be better and better every day, all the time. And you know that because Christ is unlimited. Christ is infinite. And we'll know more of Jesus all the time when we're in heaven. All through eternity. Christ is the inexhaustible Christ. You'll never exhaust Him. That's how wonderful heaven will be, more and more all the time. But one thing is, we're going to judge angels. How much more things that pertain to this life? You see, Paul gives you that wonderful truth, 1 Corinthians 6, when he's talking about Christians going to law with one another. He says, the very idea, you Christians going to a law court with one another. You can't settle those things out of law court. And when he's talking about a mundane thing, an earthly thing like going to law court, then he gives you this wonderful truth. We shall judge angels. You see, man was made lower than the angels. And if Adam and Eve had never sinned, they were lower than the angels. But they're saved after they sinned. And you know what's true in the overall picture is true of your individual life. I know that some of you here haven't gone deeply into sin as much as some others have gone deeply into sin. It's always true in any group like that. I've had plenty of sins in my life, but in the early part of my life, everything was very sheltered. My mother and father kept their eyes on me, and I'm so glad they did. They helped me in a lot of different ways. And I didn't go deeply into outward sin as some have done. Some of you have gone more deeply into outward sin than others. And you have to say, well, the others have a head start on me, and I just can't ever amount to anything much. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. And Adam and Eve are going to be much higher in heaven than they would have been if they'd never fallen into sin. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. Now that's the story of redemption as we're going to trace it through the whole Bible. Not from the tree of life to the tree of life by way of the tree, but from the tree of life to the orchard of life. Far better than before. Because of what Jesus did when He died for us on the cross of Calvary. On page 5, we come to our second principle. Seek to get a bird's eye view of the book as a whole. The factual content of the book of Genesis may be outlined as follows. Chapters 1 to 11, the need of redemption, as shown by God's dealings in the human race as a whole before the call of Abraham. Now those first 11 chapters of Genesis cover more than 2,000 years of human history. They cover more than 2,000 years of human history. See, when you come to Abraham, you're about 2000 BC. Abraham's about as far on the other side of Christ as we are in the 20th century AD on this side of Christ. And 2,000 plus years are covered in those first 11 chapters. You see, the Bible just touches on great mountain peaks of history in those first 11 chapters. Then chapters 12 to 50, God's dealing with the chosen part of the human race, the channel of redemption, Israel, as a family under the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. By noting, by the way, in your left-hand margin, by the outline, just write the word responsible. I hold you responsible for this. Often I like to put certain facts right down here in mimeograph form rather than have you try to write them down. And then I like to have you write down the meaning of those facts. That's the general policy that I seek to follow in these notes. By noting the above outline, or any outline you prefer, by remembering that Genesis is a Greek word which means beginning or origin, and by glancing very quickly through Genesis, state clearly what you believe to be the theme or central message of the book of Genesis, and show briefly how this theme is developed throughout the entire book. Many express the theme of Genesis in the word beginnings. That's what Genesis means, beginnings. That's a good way to summarize it. To me, it's a little bit more real if I use another word, because this other word helps me to relate Genesis to all the rest of the Bible. I just use the word foundations. The central message of Genesis is in the word foundations. You know, you have your foundations of your building, and then you have the superstructure that's built on that foundation. Now, the whole Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is one book in the Hebrew arrangement of the Old Testament. It's all the book of foundations. But I like to call Genesis the foundation of the foundations. It starts right at the very beginning, and it's the great book of foundations. Now, here's a diagram that I use to summarize the central message of Genesis. I use my thickly shaded figure, and I use the thickly shaded figure for all 5 books of the Pentateuch, each one separately, to show that each one is a foundational book. But I use this thickly shaded figure for Genesis. Here, Genesis chapters 1 to 11. That's the first big section. And then the second part is the last 39 chapters of Genesis, 12 to 50. The first part I like to call foundational truths in general. Foundational truths in general. The more I study these first 11 chapters of Genesis, the more I stand amazed at how much the Holy Spirit has packed into these chapters. So many read them and they just don't seem to get anything much out of them. But foundational truth is something that you can't get along without, or the whole building will collapse if you can't see that. I see some of you in the back have a little trouble with the blinkers. You're not as old as I am, but I'm having more trouble with them. But this is about as good a job as I can do with the chalk. The foundational truths in general. Then these last 39 chapters we call foundational characters and characteristics. These 4 great men, fathers and sons and grandsons: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And as we go along, we'll gradually fill out this diagram. Over on the left-hand side from Abraham, we'll write a word showing the main way in which he was a foundational character. Then over in the right-hand side, we'll write a word showing what was his foundational characteristic. Now notice the word foundation or foundational. It's something you can't get along without. Some folks have the idea, well, it'd be real nice to have something like that. But one of my preacher friends was talking to a man who was married and had a large family of children. And he talked to him about just giving his life to the Lord and trusting Jesus for everything. The man said, I tell you, I can't take on anything extra. He said, you know, I've got a wife and a large family of children, and I just can't take on anything extra. Well, this isn't taking on anything extra. What would you say about Abraham is the foundational characteristic? Then for these other men, it won't be quite as evident to you, but this is repeated so often about Abraham. When you think of Abraham, you think of the man who had what great quality? Faith. See, now that isn't just a good thing to have. That is foundational. And the whole building will collapse without that. He that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. That's the 11th chapter of Hebrews. And then Isaac, how was he a foundational character? Then what was the foundational characteristic in his life? Same thing true of Jacob, same thing true of Joseph. We'll fill that out as we go along. But that's the overall picture of Genesis. And I use the thickly shaded chalk here just to show the foundational nature of it. Chapters 1 to 11, as we're going into it, I just want you to see how many foundational truths there are in these first 11 chapters of Genesis. Our third principle is to note the place of Genesis in the canon of Scripture. In your study of each book in the Bible, you'll find it helpful to remember the widely accepted fact. I don't know whether you have the word commonly or not, but if you have commonly accepted fact, just change it to widely. The widely accepted fact that the order of the books in our English Bibles is providentially guided by God. Why does Genesis come first? Well, you see, the answer to this comes as the outgrowth of the answer to the other question. It comes first because it's the book of foundations. And since it is the book of foundations, let me just suggest this prayer for you to offer in the study of Genesis. The prayer is, Lord, lay deep foundations in my life through the study of Genesis. Lord, lay deep foundations in my life through the study of Genesis. For a good many years, I used to teach at a Bible college. When I taught at the Bible college, my greatest joy was always teaching the freshman Bible class. I taught them Old Testament survey in their freshman year. And I had a good many who've written me and spoken about it later and just said, I started off with the foundations there. Well, you see, it's because I was teaching the part of the Bible that's especially designed to lay the foundation. As I look out on you precious young people, the smaller children over here and the older children here, and then by my imagination, the older folks up in Virginia, I realize why God has caused us to study Genesis. To lay deep foundations in our lives. To lay deep foundations in our lives. The fourth principle is the outgrowth of the others. Ask God to open your heart completely to the distinctive contribution of the book of Genesis. Now you see what we mean by distinctive contribution. There's something God has for you in Genesis that He doesn't have for you in any other books of the Bible. And there's something God has for you in Exodus He doesn't have for you in any other books of the Bible. Now that's more evident in some books than it is in others. But you know there are 5 books in the Bible just have 1 chapter. There's 1 in the Old Testament, the book of Obadiah, which has 1 chapter. Then there are 4 in the New Testament that have only 1 chapter. Philemon, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. And you can see how this would be true in Genesis or Exodus or Revelation or a longer book. But something's lacking in my life if I'm not thoroughly acquainted with 2 John or 3 John or Jude. Some have this idea, well, 2 John comes after 1 John, and really you've got everything from 2 John already in 1 John, and it's more in detail. Therefore, you don't need 2 John. Yes, you do. See, Dr. Griffith Thomas, the well-known Bible teacher, used to say there are no luxuries in the Bible. They're all necessities. And as you go along, something's lacking in your life.